Well, hello and welcome to today's presentation of the Chautauqua Lecture Series. I'm John Mann, of course, Director of Education for Lakeside. This week's lecture series will explore the region of the U.S. known as the Great Plains, a vast region of flat grasslands that stretches across North America and parts of Canada. And I'd like to welcome Elena Hart to present the lecture, Chief Standing Bear and the Poncas. Elena is the Education Coordinator at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museum, where she provides a wide variety of educational opportunities for the visitors to the museum through school tours, curriculum development, and education programming and events. And this presentation serves as a case study on the impact of Native American policy in the United States during the 1870s and the 1890s. Chief Standing Bear and the Ponca people were forced to leave their ancestral homeland in Nebraska and move 600 miles south to a reservation in present-day Oklahoma in 1877. And Elena will share this story today using her primary source collections at the Hayes Museum. I would ask if you please mute your cell phones if you haven't already, and help me in welcoming Elena Hart.
Well, thank you so much, John, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming out to hear this presentation today on the Standing Bear and the Ponca case study of Native American policy during the Gilded Age. This actually comes from research from part of our Gilded Teachers League program, which our curatorial and education department helps to run, which is for 6 through 12 grade social studies educators. Throughout this program, we develop resource guides that connect these teachers to primary sources in our collections, as well as ones accessible on the website of the Library of Congress. And our goal is to connect them to these primary sources and explore different topics throughout U.S. history. So for this year, we focused on Native American policy during the Gilded Age time period. And one of the groups we chose to focus on was Standing Bear and the Ponca. And that's the research from this presentation comes from today. And I'm very excited to tell this story with you all and explore a little bit more. And I do like to start this presentation with a photo of a family. And as you might have guessed by the title of the presentation, this family is Standing Bear's family. You will see him here, as well as his wife, Suzette, and 3 children that are around them. And this photo was actually published in a book that shared the story of Standing Bear in 1880. And it featured this picture alongside the entire documented record of their removal and the court case and the lecture tour that followed that we'll be exploring in more detail today. And to me, when I first saw this picture, it was something that brought a very human element to a topic that otherwise can feel very surface level. It showed that this policy really held an impact on real people and Native Americans that existed during this time. And when we finish the presentation today, I'll return to this photo with a little bit more added context as well to it, because it speaks a lot about the experience that they had specifically, but that a lot of different Native American tribes, especially across the Plains region, would also experience during this time period.
Question.
Yes.
What is the wife's name? His name was Standing Bear. What was her name?
Yes, so it is listed as Suzette. I can't remember specifically if she also had a Native American name alongside that. Typically, she's referred to as Suzette in most of the documentation that I found, but that's a great question. All right, now historians do typically categorize Indigenous policy in the U.S. into 6 distinct phases, but for our purposes today, we'll be investigating the transition that occurred during the Gilded Age as the reservation system was established and a push for assimilation through education and land allotment began. This transition was due to both ideological changes throughout the country as well as practical changes in the structure of the government and how this policy was run. For example, the Office of Indian Affairs had been moved from the War Department to the Interior Department in 1849, signaling a shift in both thought and governance for Native Americans across the country. During the 1800s, the U.S. government, media, and public often referred to Native Americans by way of the Indian question or the Indian problem. And there were 2 prevailing answers during this time, and the shift in thought is what we're going to be looking at, because while their methods differed, They shared a common goal to both end indigenous culture within the U.S., whether by military force or through education and assimilation. The story of Standing Bear and the Ponca reflects this time period in policy in the United States, and by studying their story, we learn how and why this transition occurred, as well as the lasting impact the policy had on people across the Plains region. Now, a quick note on the government structure, because this was something I was not familiar with when I first started my research, and I thought it would be kind of helpful to just quickly show you how this was set up in the government during the 1870s, as well as some of the key players that you'll kind of see recurring throughout this story. So the Office of Indian Affairs was within the Department of the Interior. Carl Schurz is appointed the Secretary of the Interior by President Hayes throughout his administration. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs during this time, there are three main ones, but the main one who handles the Ponca case will be Ezra A. Hite. He served from 1877 to 1880, and he was responsible for reporting directly to the Department of the Interior. Underneath Hite will be superintendencies. These tend to end around the 1880 time period, but there were 13 major superintendencies up until that point, and as you can see by their names, they are located regionally throughout the country. For example, the Dakota Superintendency will be where the Ponca initially resided, and then the Central Superintendency is where they end up moving once they're relocated to Oklahoma during that time. These superintendencies were run by a superintendent, but they also had a collection of agencies, and each agency oversaw one or several different reservations throughout the country, and one agent would be responsible for those reservations. The two agents that will be of most importance for the Ponca will be Arthur J. Carrier and Edward, also E.A. Howard. So those will be the ones that we'll be mostly focusing on for today's purposes. Now, the Ponca traditionally resided in the Ohio River Valley region, but by the time Lewis and Clark set out on their expedition, the Ponca had already resided in the Plains region for generations. They were a fairly small tribe, approximately 800 people total by the 1840s, and they resided along the mouth of the Niobrara River as it flowed into the Mississippi. They also had strong familial ties with the Omaha people, who resided just southeast of the Ponca. You can see them on this map. The Ponca's traditional homeland, and then the Omahas. And they do have very strong familial as well as cultural ties with the tribe. And this map is actually quite significant because it was developed by J.H. Colton in 1855, a date which is fairly significant because the Kansas-Nebraska Act had been passed in 1854, just a year prior. As such, this map was served as an exploration of the land that had just formally been opened up to settlers. And this was something that a lot of these tribes would begin to experience more and more as settlers started to come into the land to settle along that time. Now, the Ponca did have 4 treaties with the U.S. government that did guarantee and protect their land in the Nebraska Territory. You can see the 4 listed here. The first one was in 1817, which recognized a friendly alliance between the Ponca and the U.S. government. The second treaty in 1825 is what established trade. In 1858, this is the first treaty where we do see the Ponca actually give up some of their land to the United States government and open it up to settlement. But the 1865 is the final last formal treaty that they established with the United States government that cedes more land and formally establishes their reservation right on the Niobrara as it flowed to the Mississippi River. They also did this in exchange for cash annuities as well as protection from the government because they had an antagonistic relationship with the Sioux Native Americans also in nearby neighboring their region. Now, the Ponca actually ended up losing this territory due to a mistake that was not even a part of their process with the U.S. government. It was a mistake that the U.S. government made while dealing with the Sioux. So if you see here, the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 is what established the Great Sioux Reservation. This stretched from the Black Hills in the Dakota Territory all the way to the Mississippi River in Nebraska and accidentally included the Ponca's reservation, which had been guaranteed to them in 1865. This mistake was very problematic because, as I had mentioned, the Ponca had been raided specifically by the Brule Sioux for years, and due to this new treaty, the Sioux now had a legal claim to the Ponca's land, which left the peaceful tribe open to future attacks. So talks began to move the Ponca to the Omaha Reservation in 1873, but this was never followed through. Their agent, Arthur J. Carrier, also began the process of trying to move the Ponca to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, in 1875. But this matter seemed to have been dropped until a new Indian inspector arrived at the Ponca Reservation in February of 1877. This new Indian inspector's name was Edward C. Kemble. And when he arrived in the Ponca's homeland, he informed the Ponca chiefs that they were to move to Indian Territory without question. The Ponca chiefs refused to move and explained that their land belonged to them as guaranteed through the 1865 treaty, and they also requested to speak to the president if this was not the case. They were very used to what negotiations looked like with the U.S. government. They had had 4 treaties established, and they knew this was not traditionally the way it was done. So they were very questioning what this process was and why it was happening. Kemble did initially refuse, but eventually convinced the Ponca chiefs to travel with him to go see the land in Oklahoma before agreeing to move. Essentially, if they liked the land, they would be able to move down there, and if not, he promised to take them to Washington, D.C. to renegotiate with the president and come to terms with this matter in more detail. Several of the Ponca chiefs, including Standing Bear, depart from their home with Kemble by train to go see this land. However, once they arrived, they did find that the land was completely wrong for their purposes and requested to be taken to see the president. Kemble refused and hurried them to make their decision. Quote, he said, "Be quick, show yourselves brave, act like men," which really essentially meant that they had no option. And once the Ponca realized this, they requested to return home to Nebraska. And they actually ended up leaving Kemble there. Now, when they do return to their home in Nebraska, they find that Kemble is already there, and he has ordered the Ponca people to pack up their belongings and move. If they refused, Kemble threatened that the soldiers would use violence against them, so it was non-negotiable at this point. Standing Bear and his brother Big Snake were detained after telling the people that Kemble had no right to take their land from them, and feeling like they had no other real option, a small group of Ponca, about 170 members, do leave with Kemble in April of 1877. This is the first move that the Ponca take down to Oklahoma. The remainder of the tribe left shortly after in May of 1877. And all this time, the reasoning for the removal is still this mistake that was made with a separate treaty with the Sioux people in 1868, and that they needed to protect the Ponca from these potential warring factions that could arise. Now, the agent tasked with moving the Ponca to Oklahoma, his name was E.A. Howard, and he actually documented their entire journey south in what was known as the Journal of the March, which was published in 1877's Annual Report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. The journal documents the Ponca's harrowing 600-mile journey south that began in May and ended in July of 1877. According to Howard, the Ponca traveled on average 12 miles a day, but sometimes up to 25 miles depending on the amount that they could go. They encountered cold weather, severe storms, including one tornado, that often washed away bridges and left roads impassable. Many Ponca individuals became sick, were injured, and died during this tragic journey that has since become known as the Ponca Trail of Tears, including one of Standing Bear's daughters, Prairie Flower. This loss of life only continued upon arriving to their new reservation, where they found that no provision had been made for them. They had been forced to leave their home, where they had begun the process of assimilating. They had built log cabins from sawed lumber. They had cultivated their crops and had cattle that they were raising. They even had a schoolhouse at their reservation. And they had a minister who would preach to them as well every Sunday that they attended. So they left that home behind, and in exchange, they found land that had not been developed yet in preparation for them, and they were given tents to reside in. They did not have enough time before winter would come and the rainy season to cultivate that land or to build sufficient lodging before winter would set in. This tragedy of the removal is actually further compounded by a revelation found inside the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, E.A. Height's report on the Ponca removal. According to Height, the removal of the Ponca by land had been selected as the more economical option in comparison to alternate transportation routes. However, due to the unexpected and unprecedented storms that they encountered, the removal ended up costing more than it would have if train or water transit had been used. As a result, the portion of funds that was initially set aside to help the Ponca settle into their new reservation was instead used for the removal itself, which left the Ponca exposed to the elements in an unfamiliar land without sufficient money and time to again prepare for winter. You'll also see that Howard actually acknowledges this as well. This is directly in his report on the Ponca removal following his Journal of the March. And he said, "I am of the opinion that the removal of the Poncas from the northern climate of Dakota to the southern climate of Indian Territory at the season of the year it was done will prove a mistake, and that a great mortality will surely follow among the people when they shall have been here for a time and become poisoned with the malaria of the climate. It is a matter of astonishment to me that the government should have ordered the removal of the Ponca Indians from Dakota to Indian Territory without having first made some provision for their settlement and comfort." By the end of their first year in Oklahoma, the Ponca had lost nearly 150 members of their tribe. This equated to about a quarter of their entire population. The loss of life continued over the next several years, and by 1890, on this next map, you'll actually be able to see as well the restricted reservation. So right here, this small block of land is the land that's set aside for the reservation by 1890. I think this map, specifically in comparison to the 1855 map, shows a lot of, not just the loss of life, but the loss of land, the loss of their home that they did encounter. In the previous map, it was very widespread, not very defined by their boundaries, but here you do see very small, very restrictive land that they are provided for in Oklahoma. With the dire situation at hand, several Ponca chiefs, including Standing Bear, traveled to Washington, D.C. in November of 1877 to negotiate and request the rights to return back to their home in Nebraska. Unfortunately, like many other Native American delegations at this time, they encountered a lot of sympathy, but little action that was done to resolve some of these issues. This photo in particular is actually taken of the Ponca delegation that traveled to Washington, D.C. by Charles Milton Bell. He was a very famous photographer during this time, known for documenting Native American delegations as they came to Washington, D.C. Through this photo, you can see some of the evidence of their assimilation practices that they had already started. You can see the mix of traditional with the mainstream Anglo-Saxon wear and clothing. And you can also see the tribal structure that they had. At that time, the Ponca had about 9 different bands within their large tribe, and each of those bands had a chief who was responsible for them. So you can see all 9 of those chiefs here, as well as 2 of the interpreters in the back here. So these will be interpreters for the Ponca. Standing Bear is right here. And then the list of the rest of them are also here, including White Swan and Standing Buffalo. Now, this delegation did meet with President Hayes November 9th, 1877 in the Cabinet Chamber of the Executive Mansion. They actually met with Hayes, Secretary Schurz, Commissioner Height, and their own agent, E.A. Howard, to discuss their return home. During this meeting, several of the chiefs laid their grievances in front of the president, and several newspapers in the area did report on this meeting. In the Baltimore Sun, they share Chief White Eagle's response to President Hayes. He said, "I have met you today, and it appears to me as if I had been walking through a dark cloud and came into the light. I have come to lay some complaints before you, and there will be a great many of them. The Great Spirit moves in us all, in whites and in the Indian. The Great Spirit made everything for us, the land and water and the timber, and out of that I have my rights. We have always been living on a certain reservation, but now we have been disturbed and made to take another road. Our forefathers were advised to till the soil, and that advice has been followed." Hayes did listen to each complaint laid in front of him by each of the Ponca chiefs, and he left them explaining that he would consider their requests carefully before letting them know his answer. He expressed his desire to do the best for him that he possibly could. He does end up meeting with them actually the following day on November 10th once he has his answer and response. And Hayes acknowledged that the Ponca had always been peaceful and listened to the government and offered his sympathy. He permitted the Ponca to go in search of a new tract of land in Indian Territory and promised to supply them with the resources they left behind in Nebraska, including the log cabins, farming equipment, cattle, and ensured that they would be able to set them up so everything that they had lost would then be provided for them in this new land that they were going to be given. However, he did not let the Ponca return home to Nebraska, as he stated that the land had been given up to other people, so they cannot have it again. Also in his response, he does write this, which shows a lot of the approach that the government took towards Native Americans during this time. And it says, when the white people first came to the country, through which you have traveled on your way here, and in which you have seen such flourishing farms and large towns, they also were poor and they suffered much hardship, but they went to work with courage and industry, and they became as rich and as happy as you now see them. You must follow their example and go to work, and thus you will soon better your condition. If you do that, I shall remember that the Poncas are good Indians, and I shall do all that is in my power to lend you a helping hand. I mean to be a good friend to you as you have been to the white people. I have been glad to see you here, and my best wishes will be with you in your new home. This response really does show that I believe there was quite extensive miscommunication as to what had actually happened with the Ponca and the blunder that happened in the Treaty of 1868, which, of course, their removal had been initiated under the Grant administration, and then with the Hayes administration coming in, you kind of see this very miscommunication where some people don't necessarily know all the details of what is happening. And I think that this comes through with even Hayes's quote here, where he talks about assimilating essentially into what their culture is with log cabins and farming and developing that, and completely misses that they already had that in their home in Nebraska, which was taken away from them. So again, I think you start to see some of that miscommunication and misunderstanding that was happening during this time. Now, the chiefs do also have responses to Hayes following him, and one that I found particularly interesting actually came from Chief Standing Buffalo to Hayes, specifically at the end of this section where he says, "Of course, I am like all other Indians. The Indians that you think I am afraid of, I am not afraid of them at all. I am afraid of the whites, and that is the reason I always thought you would give me my rights." Now, this is one part of this quote that upon my first read, I definitely had some questions. At first, I didn't know if possibly there had been also some misunderstanding between the threat that existed by the Sioux having legal claim over the Ponca land. But then I reconsidered and I thought, well, perhaps he's saying more damage has been done to me by the government and our removal, more so than what the threat was in Nebraska. But this was one quote that kind of stuck with me as I dived into this research a little bit more. And it becomes clarified a little bit more as I go through this research that we'll look at a little bit later in the PowerPoint too. So after Hayes' response, the Ponca do remain in their new territory in Oklahoma. And they do establish their new reservation. Improvements are made, but the progress on this is still fairly slow. By 1879, 2 years after they had left their home in Nebraska, the Ponca had actually lost over 200 people since first leaving. One of those people that passed away was Standing Bear's son, Bear Shield. He died after becoming ill in their new home in Oklahoma. And on his son's deathbed, Standing Bear actually promised to bury him back in their homeland where their grandfathers laid, rather than in the unfamiliar land of Oklahoma. In January of 1879, Standing Bear, along with 30 followers, departed for Nebraska on foot for this very purpose. It was upon orders from Washington, when they learned of the Ponca returning to Nebraska, that orders from Washington came in, sent to General George Crook to arrest them when they arrived, and that they would be detained at Fort Omaha. They were actually supposed to initially just depart back for Oklahoma, but the soldiers said that they were too sick and weary upon their travels, so they held them there in Fort Omaha so that they could recover to make the trip back. Regardless of the reason, 5 days later, Thomas Tibbles, editor of the Omaha Daily Herald, published Standing Bear's story in the newspaper and used this media to quickly gain support from across the country. And you can actually see the original newspaper that was printed here, Tuesday, April 1st, 1879, Criminal Cruelty. And this is Thomas Tibbles. Later, when people would ask Tibbles how he came to initially learn of Standing Bear's story, he gave a lot of vague answers of an unidentified city editor who had tipped him off. But it wasn't actually until 1905 in Tibble's memoir where he directly answered this question and claimed that General George Crook had actually been the one who approached him to take on Standing Bear's case. Tibbles wrote in his 1905 memoir that suddenly General George Crook came in. I could see by his face that something had gone very wrong. During my 25 or 30 years that I've been on the plains in government service, he told me, I've been forced many times by orders from Washington to do most inhuman things in dealing with the Indians, but now I'm ordered to do more cruel a thing than ever before. I would resign my commission if that would prevent the order from being executed, but it would not. These were the basic facts of the pathetic story which General Crook told me that night with force and deep feeling. You have a great daily newspaper here which you can use, he argued finally. You're perfectly acquainted with all the crimes of the Indian ring at Washington. I ask you to go into this fight against those who are robbing these helpless people. You can win, I'm sure of it. Now, Tibbles does meet with Ponca, or with Standing Bear, and he does agree to take on this case and print it in the newspaper. And it is Tibbles' media coverage that ignited the public support for Standing Bear and led to two lawyers actually agreeing to take on their case pro bono. The court case Standing Bear versus Crook, 1879, took place from May 1st through 2nd at the Omaha Post Office in the Customs House in Nebraska. District Judge Elmer S. Dundee is the one who oversaw the case. For Standing Bear, the attorneys Andrew J. Poppleton and Jackson L. Webster stepped up to the plate, and they sued for a writ of habeas corpus, claiming that the Ponca and Standing Bear had been unlawfully detained and that they were considered to be persons under the law with the right to do this. The U.S. attorney, his name was G.M. Lambertson, and he argued in the opposition, saying that the Ponca could not leave their reservation in Oklahoma without prior approval from their agent. And not only that, but he also argued that the Ponca were not considered persons under the law and therefore did not even have the right to challenge this with a writ of habeas corpus in the court system. Now, this is also the court case. Standing Bear does get to testify, and this is a very famous quote. If you've heard of this story before ever, you've probably read this quote somewhere. But Standing Bear does testify. Suzette LaFlèche, who was actually in Omaha, she was the daughter of one of the last official chiefs of the Omaha people. She interprets for Standing Bear during this court case, and he addressed Dundee specifically, stretched out his hand to him and said, "That hand is not the color of yours, but if I pierce it, I shall feel pain. If you pierce your hands, you also feel pain. The blood that will flow from mine will be of the same color as yours. I am a man, the same God made us both." And this quote weighs very heavily on the people who are in attendance at the court case, and it is one that Standing Bear is probably the most famous for saying in this time. Now, Judge Dundee does take time after this to determine his ruling for this time. And it is on May 12th that he actually issues his final decision. And he does rule, you can see the full decision here, but he does rule that an Indian is a person within the meaning of the laws of the United States. And this was actually the first time that the Native Americans were recognized as a person and that they had rights under this, which meant that he did have the right to sue for a writ of habeas corpus. And Dundee also ruled that General George Crook had unlawfully detained the Ponca and Standing Bear and that they needed to be released immediately. He also does draw straight to the Declaration of Independence when he says they have the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, drawing back on those foundational rights that the country established during its founding time. And the court decision became that first time that a Native American person is recognized as a person under the law, and it was completely a victory for Standing Bear, the Ponca, and for Tibbles, who had taken on this case with the media. In celebration, Standing Bear actually visits both of his lawyers, and he thanks them in person for the work that they had done. And when he goes to greet Webster, this is published actually in Thomas Tibble's report on the Ponca chiefs and their story. He said to Webster, "Hitherto, when we have been wronged, we went to war to assert our rights and avenge our wrongs. We took to the tomahawk. We had no law to punish those who did wrong, so we took our tomahawks and went to kill. If they had guns and could kill us first, it was the fate of war, but you have found a better way. You have gone into the court for us, and I find that our wrongs can be righted there. Now I have no more use for the tomahawk. I want to lay it down forever. I lay it down. I have no more use for it. I have found a better way. And this is something that Standing Bear is very acknowledged for by historians and the public in general, is that no matter what experience they were enduring, they always remained peaceful, and they always approached it with an acknowledgement of their rights first, but approached it in a peaceful way as best as they could to fight for their rights to the land that they owned. Now, this groundbreaking decision in 1879 would go on to influence future civil rights cases for Indigenous people, government policy, and public opinion. It also reflected on and called back to the original rights that had been outlined in the Declaration of Independence. However, this court case was very situational, and it only applied to Standing Bear and the 30 Poncas that had traveled with him back to their home in Nebraska. It did not apply to all Native Americans throughout the country. In order to do so, the case would need to be appealed and brought before the Supreme Court. And this was an issue that Standing Bear, Tibbles, and Suzette LaFlèche take up. They do launch a lecture tour across the eastern coast of the country, and they share Standing Bear's story. He gets up and shares, and Suzette LaFlèche will interpret for him. They go along the East Coast from 1879 to 1880, and their goal is to help raise funds in order to take the court case to the Supreme Court. For example, Standing Bear does speak to 1,000 people at an event in Chicago, and they do raise $1,800, according to an article published in the Chicago Tribune, 1879. This goal, unfortunately, would never be realized by their initiatives, but they did gain substantial public support through this lecture tour. And one of those advocates is Helen Hunt Jackson, who, after hearing Standing Bear's story for one of the first times at these lectures, becomes one of the most famous advocates for Native American policy and reform during this time. In December of 1879, under her pseudonym H.H., Jackson actually called out several of the injustices against Native Americans, the Ponca, but also other tribes that had injustices done to them that she had learned of. And she called out these injustices very publicly in the New York Tribune in December of 1879, even mentioning Secretary Schurz by name. You can see the first article that was written by H.H. here. Now, Carl Schurz actually did read this article, and he responded with his own that was printed in the Tribune, which is the middle article. And he tried to rebuttal some of her claims that she had made against the policy, as well as him in general. But H.H. Helen Hunt Jackson didn't back down either. She actually wrote a third article in response, which is right here. And within these articles, they, again, talk about the Ponca and that situation specifically, but they also talk about wider injustices that have been faced by Native Americans across the country during this time. Now, these articles, as well as Helen Hunt Jackson's future books, which have become very popular, A Century of Dishonor, 1881, and Ramona in 1884, helped spur on a movement and a group known as the Friends of the Indian. Again, they were aiming for this appeal of the Standing Bear court case, but they also became the biggest supporters of the assimilationist policy throughout the country. Looking back at the injustices that had been done to Native Americans, they looked for an alternate solution, and the solution they came up with was assimilation through education and land allotment. And even though this may have had good intentions and look good on paper, that policy would unfortunately go on to do more damage to Native American tribes as they continue to lose some of their tribal identity and culture, as well as a reduction in land through that land allotment process. So the public outrage over the mistreatment of the Ponca didn't just stay within the public eye, it also captured the attention of the Senate. So the Senate actually launches an investigation into the removal of the Ponca in 1880, and they call in several of those key players to testify in front of them, including Standing Bear, who does testify to the Senate February 11th, 1880, once again interpreted by Suzette LaFlèche. He's also questioned, you can see here on the committee. This whole document is actually available on the Library of Congress if you ever do want to go read it. It is several hundred pages and includes testimony from Standing Bear, as well as Kemble, as well as Arthur J. Carrier, and also Suzette LaFlèche, actually. But if you notice, the second person on this committee is H.L. Dawes, who would, of course, go on to play a very instrumental role in the passing of the Dawes Allotment Act in 1887. Several years later. So Dawes is the one who questioned Standing Bear, and throughout this testimony, I personally learned a lot about what had happened from the Ponca's perspective and Standing Bear's perspective as well. He described heavily in detail the land and the home that they left behind, again asserting that they had begun this assimilationist trajectory for them, building log cabins, cultivating the crops, and changing their way of life to better adapt to the mainstream culture of the time. He talks about their crops, which included grain, wheat, potatoes, cabbage, and onion. They owned cattle, they had horses, again, they had a schoolhouse with a minister. He also explains a little bit more of detail about that first scouting mission that the Ponca chiefs take with Kemble down to see the land in Oklahoma. And he says that once they realized they really didn't have any option, they did request that Kemble take them back to their home by train, which Kemble refused to do. They then asked for funds that they could use on their journey back by foot, and he refused once more. And they also asked for an interpreter to be sent with them, which Kemble did refuse. So the 8 chiefs did journey back by foot, and during the middle of winter, since it had been February. And he details in a lot of detail within this testimony of what that journey was like for them, having to ask people for help on the road, getting assistance where they could from different tribes, and even white settlers along the way until they finally did reach their homeland. And of course, Kemble had beaten them back there since he traveled by train. He also goes into detail on something that I found very interesting, which really challenged the entire reason for the removal. If you look at this quote towards the bottom, you'll see where he's questioned by Dawes. He asks him, "Were the Poncas and the Sioux friendly?" And Standing Bear answers, "Yes, sir, they were friendly. They used to be enemies, but they made a treaty and are now friends. The Sioux made war with the Poncas because the Poncas were friendly to the government, but afterwards they made peace." He questions again, when the treaty was made by which the land of the Poncas was given to the Sioux, were not the Poncas afraid that if the Sioux came in there would be trouble between the two tribes? And Standing Bear replied, "No, sir, we were not afraid of their making any trouble for us." So this started to, again, call back to that quote I first heard from Standing Buffalo when he said he was not afraid of the Indians they thought he was afraid of. And this provided a little bit more clarity for me, and this was further confirmed as I continued to read the testimony from Arthur J. Carrier, who had been the agent for the Ponca during the 1870s. So Arthur J. Carrier is called to take the stand, and he provides clarity during this investigation. His testimony confirms that the Ponca had been in talks to move to the Omaha Reservation in 1873 and later to Oklahoma in 1875. But this was only ever discussed as long as the Ponca agreed to move. They were not to be moved unless they agreed and consented. Furthermore, Carrier confirmed that a peace treaty had actually been orchestrated between the Brule Sioux and the Ponca, meaning that there was no more need for the removal for them to leave their home, regardless of going to the Omaha Reservation or to Oklahoma. The issue of their removal had essentially been dropped after this treaty had been designed, and they also asked Carrier if, to his knowledge, the treaty was respected by the Sioux, or if they had launched raids again on the Ponca, and he said to his knowledge they had not had any other raids following the creation of this treaty. Now, for me, this did show that there really was no reason to move the Ponca, despite it also being a mistake made by the U.S. government. That reasoning had been dropped, and that's why when Kemble does show up in 1877, a lot of the Ponca do not want to leave to leave for Omaha. That matter had completely been dropped by the tribe. It wasn't on their radar as an issue at all during that time. Now, Kemble does say that in his testimony he had no knowledge of that treaty, once again calling back to maybe some of that miscommunication that had happened between different administrations and different leaders as they filled in these different positions and that turnover. But there may have also been another reason for why they eyed the Ponca Reservation in 1877, and that's because there had actually been a second war with the Lakota Sioux, the Great Sioux War of 1876, which resulted in the loss of the Black Hills and Dakota Territory for them. For this reason, the government was actually looking to remove both the red cloud and spotted tail agencies. And in the annual report of 1877, it's seen here that they actually decided on the old Ponca Reserve to move the spotted tail agency to. As they stated, that agency was decided upon where the agency dwellings, storehouses, 150 Indian houses, and 500 acres of cultivated fields left vacant by the Poncas offer special advantages for present quarters. Now the Sioux actually are never actually moved to the Ponca Reserve. As far as I understand it, the houses remained vacant that were there, and they never actually moved into them. Now, Hayes personally also reflects a lot on the public outcry, the Senate investigation, and the story of the Ponca that he's learned since first encountering them in 1877 and having that meeting in Washington, D.C. He actually writes in his diary that a great and grievous wrong has been done to the Ponca in December of 1880. And I should note, this is the only time I've come across in his diary where Hayes calls out a specific tribe and writes about them personally by name. So to me, that signaled that this situation did weigh quite heavily on his heart once he learned of the full extent of the situation that had actually occurred to the Ponca. Hayes was also very good friends with General George Crook, and in this diary entry, he also was very determined to investigate the Ponca situation for himself and come to the final matter for his own personal sake. He actually does meet with Crook in D.C. later that month, and while it's not certain what was discussed during their meeting, Hayes created a special commission to investigate the Ponca situation the following day, and he actually appointed Crook as the chairman of that commission. The commission's findings are published in a special message from the President of the United States in 1881. And in this report, Hayes confirmed that the Senate investigation's original findings, which was for the recommendations for compensation of the Ponca, should be honored. Additionally, Hayes outlined a four-step Native American policy that he believed should be guiding principles for the country moving forward. And this is where you also see the 4 points beginning to favor the assimilationist policy, specifically through education and the land allotment policy. You can see the education outlined in point 1, and then that land allotment in point 2 as well. Later on in this special message, he also quoted, "I do not undertake to apportion the blame for injustice done to the Poncas. Whether the executive or Congress or the public is chiefly in fault is now not a question of practical importance. As the chief executive at the time when the wrong was consummated, I am deeply sensible that enough of the responsibility for the wrong justly attaches to me, and I make it my particular duty and earnest desire to do all I can to give to these injured people that measure of redress which is required alike by justice and humanity." So once again, seeing that Hayes did take the situation of the Poncas, once he learned the full story, very much to heart, and he did take full accountability of the mistake that had happened. And this section to me was very interesting, especially in light of a separate passage in the Ponca Chiefs, again the book passed by Thomas Tibbles, covering their story. Within that book, White Eagle had actually called out the president specifically, and he said, "When I went to see the president and told him how we had been wronged, he said that those who did the deed were gone, and it was among the things of the past. I now ask that the president once again, through this message, which I sent to all the white people of this land, to rectify his mistake. When a man desires to do what is right, he does not say to himself, 'It does not matter,' when he commits a wrong." So even though I don't know for sure if Hayes ever did read that part in the Ponca Chiefs, we still see him taking that ownership and that responsibility and taking steps as best he could to rectify the mistakes that had been done, regardless of whose fault it had been at that point in time. Now, with this alignment of the assimilation policy moving more into the country, we actually also do see the establishment of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School during Hayes' administration as well in 1879. And then, of course, followed by the Dawes Allotment Act passed in 1887. And as I mentioned earlier, this assimilation policy, though perhaps well-intentioned, did do a significant amount of damage to tribal individual culture. Especially it affected the lives once more of Standing Bear and his family. William Snake was actually a student who attended Carlisle Indian Industrial School from 1880 to 1883. He was the son of Big Snake, and he was the nephew of Standing Bear. And there was a newspaper published by Carlisle called the Italkitato that would often publish letters that adults wrote to their family members who were attending Carlisle. And in one of the newspapers of June 1881, you'll see a letter that is included to William Snake from his uncle Standing Bear. And throughout this article, this letter that he writes him, you'll see that he does encourage him to continue to learn his education, learn civilization, all things Christian people do, encouraging him to do as best he can while at Carlisle. And the content of the letter isn't too surprising, especially considering what followed next, which was again a callback to that Indian question. If you remember at the beginning of this presentation, that was the way that a lot of them framed this topic at the time. And it is very much positing education as an answer to this question that had existed in the country and this assimilationist policy. So we see it fully solidify more during this time, lead up through the Hayes administration into the 1880s. Now, in January of 1882, Standing Bear actually did request that William be permitted to go home on vacation, and this request was forwarded to the Office of Indian Affairs, and I'm not sure if it was ever granted or not, but unfortunately it is documented on the Carlisle Industrial website that unfortunately William did pass away a year later in 1883, and his notice is sent out to them there. Now, Standing Bear's legacy and present day. This brings me back to the photo that we did begin with of Standing Bear and his family. And I did put a little more context into this photo. So the first time, like I said, when I saw this photo, I knew it brought back the humanity of the policy that this had affected, the real people that it affected the lives of. But I had missed that they also showed how each of these people were related to one another. This was actually the orphan grandson of Standing Bear. The child in the back, Sunshine, was the only living child of Standing Bear and Suzette LaFlèche. And on the end here, Light of the Way, is the orphan niece of Standing Bear. And once I realized how each of them were connected to Standing Bear and his wife, Suzette, I realized the photo showed just as much of how the policy affected them personally, not just by who was in the photo, but also by who was missing from the photo, and the real lives and that impact that it had on their family and their experience during this time. The policy also affected the Ponca tribe, which can still be seen today because they are still split between Nebraska and Oklahoma. So if you do ever want to see their websites and learn more about them, they are available online, and you can learn a little bit more about how each tribe has been organized and adapted based on the changes from this time. But they are still split between Nebraska and Oklahoma. And then throughout this case study, I think we also start to see Standing Bear's own impact on the policy and perspective at play. The lecture tour did a lot of work to show the rights that Native Americans that they were fighting for. It very much humanized Native Americans for people. And again, it was the first court case where a Native American was recognized as a person in front of the law. And I think for me, that was a very admirable thing to realize, that even though all of this had been done to him, he persevered and stood up for his own rights, always aiming for peace, but was very steadfast in that and persevered forward in a way that not only shaped his life and that of the 30 followers that came with him, but also shaped lives of Native Americans for the next 100 years. Also, and today when I did my research, I did realize there was a congressional bill, H.R. 10, that was launched a couple years ago, I believe, which was to conduct the study of feasibility on building a Chief Standing Bear National Historic Trail, which showed me that this history is important also to remember, and that through landmarks like this, if it does get approved, it's one way that we can look back on that history and remember the work that was done and the work that people are still doing within this time. And with that, that ends my presentation today. So if you guys do have any questions, please feel free to let me know. And thank you again for listening to the story of Standing Bear and the Ponca.
I think last year we had a portrayal of Standing Bear. It was in 2023, and he was quite interesting. I'm not sure if he was a relative, but he did say that there now is a statue of Standing Bear in Washington, D.C.
Yes, yes, and there's also a museum, I believe, in Nebraska as well, dedicated to Standing Bear, and the statue's pretty famous. If you ever see it online, it is a callback to his time during that court where he extends his hand to Dundee, and you'll see him do that. So that quote, again, that he's very famous for knowing, and so it's a really, really beautiful memorial to him and the work that was done. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where is that in Nebraska?
I believe it's near the Ponca Reservation. I might have to double check the exact location, but if I remember correctly, it would be near their reservation that's there today.
I was surprised to hear that the tribe was split, because it seemed like that Mr. Kemble, who always denied everything, would have taken all of the Ponca and not just some.
Yes.
How was it that some were left?
Yes. So Kemble does leave first with the first group of 170 Ponca, and at the time the tribe was numbering about 700 to 800 during that first move. As far as I understood it, the thought when he left was that the rest of the Ponca will be marched south regardless of if I leave or not, and this group is willing to go. Standing Bear also mentioned that the group that went were not all full-blooded Ponca, and that they tended to have a mix of white as well as Ponca within that group, and so I think they already felt a little different from the rest of the Ponca, and Standing Bear acknowledges that during his testimony as one of the reasons why they may have been more willing to go versus the rest of the Ponca who wanted to stay there. But again, the thought for Kemble was they're going to be moving regardless. They already had soldiers that had been called in, and Howard was assigned the task of getting the rest of them down to Oklahoma at that time.
Are the Poncas completely assimilated now, or do they still have their own separate places in Nebraska and Oklahoma?
Yes, so they both still have reservations in Oklahoma and Nebraska, and when I went to their websites, they have a lot of pride in their heritage, and they also, you can see some of the ways that they still keep that traditional Native American culture alive today, and that's something that after the assimilation policy, that was the goal, was to end that traditional culture and get them fully into white society and mainstream culture. But a lot of Native American tribes, not just the Ponca, have held on to that tradition that they had. And so you can see on their websites a whole list of ways that they keep that tradition and culture alive today. Even though, of course, they've made adjustments and have assimilated in different ways. There's that mix there for sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.